Hey everyone, my name is Devin Moreno. I'm a Baltimore City investor and I've been doing this for about 3.5 years. Been documenting my journey just trying to renovate houses and learning from ground zero, not having any money, to now owning 15 houses at this point, mostly within the Baltimore City area. So today I wanted to show you this house, which is kind of going to be my story of permit hell. And essentially we are now officially $47,000 over budget, and that is all strictly due to permits or permitting process. So I wanted to talk about why do some people renovate so often without permits, what the process like with permits, and kind of talk about some of the reasons people do and don't do that. So in this house, just to get a little backstory, we actually started out trying to renovate it with permits. We actually were trying to do it the right way. I have done it without permits before. I will admit that. Obviously, starting out, permits add complications that, are a little bit hard for a newer investor. But this house here was about my 9th house. And so at that point, I felt comfortable enough to go ahead and do it. It's a full gut. You're gonna see all these photos here of a lot of the renovation we went through. But essentially, we gutted it from top to bottom. I figured, okay, we definitely need to get permits for this process. We tried to hire 2 engineers, 2 of them, to get this done. And it was actually very difficult. It took about 2 months to get all the permits through. And even then we decided, you know what? Let's go ahead and renovate this without permits. Let's just run through it and then worry about that later. We ended up eventually getting caught, and I'll explain that whole process. And then once we actually got caught, that's when we tried to fix it, do it the right way. And it's taken another 2 months to get that back on track. So altogether, 4 months of this house sitting pretty much like this, can't do anything with it, trying to either get permits or trying to resolve the permit problem. So basically, I wanted to talk to you about the next step. Why is it that investors don't get permits? Is it this waiting period? What is it that they do? Why is it they go ahead and renovate houses throughout Baltimore without them all the time? So let me talk to you about it. So one of the first reasons that a lot of investors don't pull permits here in this city, at least, is it does make the process a little bit more expensive. See, a lot of the stuff you're seeing in this house has to be done totally differently if you want to do it to code. Okay, so a lot of people will like to cut corners, and maybe plumbers start using studio vents all over the place, or electricians don't use the right circuit breakers, or HVAC techs start cutting corners around certain codes. Now keep in mind, not all code is meant necessarily to make the house work. Some of it is more for like environmental reasons that often a lot of times investors want to cut corners on because it's not affecting the house, but it is affecting their bottom line. So some of those costs will shoot up. There are ways that some investors get around that, but many will just choose not to deal with it at all and decide, you know what, if I don't have to pull permits, then I won't have to do a lot of this extra stuff. Now, there is a downside to doing that. Sometimes you're going to get a contractor who wants to cut corners on you. So you're gonna have to know what you're doing in order to evaluate if your contractor is doing everything correctly. Because that's what you can almost think of the permit inspectors of doing for you, is they're kind of that backup looking for you, all right? They're that person who knows this trade, knows that business, and they're telling you, hey, look, this doesn't look right, that doesn't look right. So that's an advantage for you to use an inspector, but that extra cost is one reason that investors don't like using them sometimes. Now, another reason that investors in the city don't want to call permits in is a lot of times they want to do something illegal with the house. So some of these houses are very easily turned into, let's say, a duplex. That's one example, all right? So it's very easily turned into a duplex, but if you are not zoned properly to turn it into a duplex, well, you can't. You're not going to be able to add like an extra HVAC system. Well, you can add that, but you have to make sure it looks obviously for the same house. You can't necessarily just start throwing in things and then clearly make it look separated, but then say, oh, I'm going to rent this as a single family or whatnot. The permit inspector will stop you. Another thing is multiple kitchens. Having another stove that's going to throw off your entire permit inspection process. Once again, seasoned investors do learn to get around this, but as a newer investor, you're going to run into that problem if you're trying to bend the rules. There are other things, making parking and stuff where you know you're not going to be able to make parking. All right, there's a lot of things and rules that you can't do, but you know will make your property more valuable if you do it. A lot of times, another common example is renting a duplex as a triplex. That is an easy cash flow machine. You basically bought a triplex for the cost of a duplex, but to actually put that third kitchen in and call it a wet bar or whatever, it starts getting pretty tricky around the inspectors who have seen this. They know what you're doing. So that is another reason people don't like pulling permits. The third reason is a lot of times is the permit inspectors themselves. Sometimes there's a particular inspector that they don't want to deal with. And so a lot of times, you know, if they want to kind of cut corners, and maybe the cost wouldn't go up, but they just know they don't want to have to deal with this extra thing. Actually, most common example, a lot of times, is you want to do something that's totally legitimate, but bringing an inspector into your house will suddenly make them look at everything else going on in the house. They may want to rip open walls and they can see unpermitted work in the past. So let's say you did a little bit of renovation and it's fine, and then you decide later on to do some permitted work. Well, if you invite that inspector into your home, they're going to notice the other stuff, possibly notice the other stuff that you didn't do, or maybe the previous person didn't do. Because remember, the permits and stuff are tied to the house itself, not the owner. So when you buy a house with unpermitted work, that's your problem now. So if you end up buying that house and then want to make renovations and you want to do it the right way, sometimes they're going to make you rip open the walls to make sure the previous owner also did it the right way. So those are some things to think about on whether or not you want to pull permits. I'm not advocating either way, but this is some of the reasons that a lot of investors don't. In my case, a lot of the houses that I did originally was mostly because I was new and just didn't understand the process. But it is fairly easy at some point. So let me give you one other corner case scenario. So one of the reasons that we decided to try to pull permits on this house and then eventually stop was we actually wanted to build an addition out here. And so originally when we were going with the engineer to pull the permits, he was taking so long to get them through Baltimore City during coronavirus that the permit process changed for additions. During that entire step, then it became much, much harder, and we had to start doing a lot of underpinning and other things that would cost a ton more money. Not to mention this addition here itself would cost a lot more money. Now, we originally factored that into our numbers, but when that permit process changed, it suddenly became too burdensome to do it. So our answers were, do it without permits and just try to get away with it, in which case we're fine, or spend the extra 10, 20K it was going to cost to get all this other underpinning stuff to put together. Not to mention, because the law was new, this was going to take a lot longer to get done. No one actually knew how to do the process. They just set it up. So basically, you're talking about months more of waiting. Keep in mind, holding costs on this renovation is $3,000 a month, which of course is how I'm factoring in my $47,000 lost, as I'm constantly waiting month after month to get permits through. So one of the reasons we did go ahead and stop the permit process and just go ahead and renovate it, continuing until we get caught, is because, you know, we wanted to build this addition, didn't want to go through the rules. So that's another reason a lot of investors will start pulling corners. So what I'm going to go ahead and go into now is why is it they do pull permits. Some of the reasons are obvious. Like I mentioned, some of them are, like we said, the permit inspectors kind of act like a second pair of eyes for you. The other thing is, if you keep going through the permit process over and over and over again and get a reputation for yourself, then you actually can get through permits a lot easier. Those who constantly try to dodge the permits never meet the inspectors, never can build that relationship with the inspectors. And a lot of times, if you keep pulling permits and you do it correctly, always the first time around, and you just build it into your estimates to do that extra cost, and you never actually want to try to do anything against the rules, a lot of the inspectors are going to remember your name. They're going to remember your face. And a lot of times they'll just walk in there and be like, I know you did it right. And then they'll pretty much walk out. I mean, or they'll just assume you're going to do it right, even if it's not finished. They'll be like, okay, this needs to be done. This needs to be done. But it's fine. I know you're going to get it done. So they cut you some slack. So that is another reason. So now I mean, other than that, it's pretty obvious. If you end up selling the house and you didn't pull permits and your work ends up hurting or killing somebody in the process, then they're gonna find out you didn't pull permits and you can get sued. And keep in mind, you have at least 3 years from the point of which you sold the house that you can easily be sued and tracked down for the fact that you didn't pull permits on this work. For many of you remember the Miami disaster where a building completely collapsed. The first thing every single lawyer wanted to do was figure out who pulled the permits and who inspected it. So that is going to be a huge point if something happens to your house, especially these old houses in Baltimore City. Another thing you want to think about is the liability concern for your tenants as well. If anything happens to them, once again, unpermitted work is going to cause problems. Electrical fires, anything like that, if they start seeing unpermitted work, your insurance may not cover it. So sometimes it's pretty dangerous to try to go through the whole process without permits, which is the reason we wanted to pull permits in the first place on this house. It just was taking a while, which I'm going to go into why in just a little bit. But that is another thing, is just all those liability factors. You sell the house, you try to rent the house, you got to make sure that everything is perfectly safe, because they're going to come back for you if it isn't.